This is episode 28 of the Life in Norway show. During my time in Norway, I've lived in both Oslo and Trondheim, but never anywhere else. My guest today, the Canadian Jill Kirchmann from the Norway Times blog, chose to move with her Norwegian husband from Oslo out to Hurlan, a small town with less than 2,000 people close to the Oslo fjord. We talk about what life is like in small town Norway, some of the lifestyle differences, and when Norway starts to feel like home. You can find out more information on today's show, including links to everything we talk about, on the show notes page. Simply head on over to alifeinnorway.net/podcast and look for episode 28. Happy listening. I'm joined today by Jill Kirchmann from the Norway Times blog. We are here today to talk about life in small town Norway. Jill, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
No problem. I'm really keen to find out what it's like to live in such a small place in Norway. But before we get into that, can you tell us what brought you to Norway in the first place?
Yeah, I think it's a similar story to many of the folks you've actually interviewed. I met my husband, who is Norwegian, met him in Canada, actually, through a mutual friend of ours who had both been studying together in the UK, in fact. And so I met him in Canada, and I think we spent all of about 30 minutes together chatting, and then sort of headed off in our different directions and stayed in touch through Facebook and that kind of stuff. And then we ended up deciding to see each other. And I actually came to Norway in November of, 2012, I guess it was. And we call it our 10-day first date, because it was literally our first date, but it lasted 10 days. and it went pretty well because, now here I am and we're married. So it was the man who brought me to Norway.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Now, I invited you on the show because I've been following your adventures from afar, because as I have done, you write a blog about your experiences in Norway. One of the things that really caught my eye was when you moved from Oslo, where a lot of international people live when they first moved to Norway, to a very small town. Now you're living in Hølen, which is in the Oslo fjord region south of Oslo. So can you tell us why you decided to move from a city to such a small place?
Yeah, absolutely. It all happened a bit sort of randomly in a way. I started making a list of things that I would sort of like to have in a home together with my husband, because we were living in Oslo in a rented apartment. So we knew we wanted to get our own place. And so I sort of started making a list, as I do. I just seem to really enjoy making lists. And I wrote a list of sort of non-negotiable things that I really wanted to have in a place, and then other, things that would have been nice. And I remember at one point showing my list to my father-in-law, and he sort of laughed, and I didn't know why, because at this point, I didn't know much about Oslo or the real estate market, or, I was very new here still, only a few months. And he sort of put all my requested items on my list into the search engine on Finn, and came up with a couple houses for us in Oslo that were all multi-million-dollar homes, like up on the hillside in Trondheim. And I realized very quickly that either I was going to have to majorly adjust what I was looking for, or we just simply weren't going to be staying in Oslo. And my husband was actually very keen to move out of the city. He's from Ålesund originally, so he's not an Oslo guy. And it turned out that we just saw this house, and it literally had every single thing on my list, including being in this little town that has its own cafe, and it has a little shop that you can walk to, and it's close to the fjord. So it all just seemed a bit too good to be true. And so when we moved here, we really moved because we loved the house and the area seemed nice. But we had no idea truly how lucky we were and how amazing this little town is. And it's come to be really the best move we could have made. So I couldn't be happier.
Okay, so I think a lot of listeners will know or have an idea of what life is like in Oslo, whether they live there or they live somewhere else in Norway, or they've never even been to Norway, just because there's so many images and videos out there about Oslo. Hurlan, can you give us an introduction? You gave us a sneak preview there, but what can somebody expect from a visit to Hurlan?
That's a good question. And I can imagine my friends in Hølen listening to this and kind of laughing when you ask that, because oftentimes when people post things on Instagram in Hølen, we have the hashtag that says keep Hølen weird, because it truly is sort of this weird, wonderful little place. From what I understand, and again, this is really the only place I've lived for a while in Norway, but from what I understand, it's a fairly atypical place. It's filled with people who seem to have made a very intentional move to be here. So in a way, it's its own little intentional community, filled with interesting people who seem to do all sorts of interesting things. Aside from their regular jobs, people are making honey and brewing beer. And there's a friend of ours in town who builds custom bikes. It's just everything you can imagine. And so when you come here, there's always some interesting event going on. We have a festival that takes place in the summer that draws performers from all over the world. I mean, it's literally a sort of world-class festival you'd expect to see in a big city, but it's in our tiny little town. It's just, it's a sort of an amazing place. And now I sound like I work for the Hurlan Tourist Board. I probably should. Maybe that would be a good job for me. I should create a Hurlan Tourist Board. But honestly, anyone who's listening who lives in Oslo or anywhere, it's worth a visit. It's just a quaint, quirky, cool little town.
So in terms of size, we're talking between 1,000-2,000 people. And what kind of services does the town have? Is it the kind of place where there's one restaurant, one cafe, one gas station, and so on?
We don't have a gas station. Now, that's crazy talk.
That's far too much.
We have one store, the Hurlan Boutique, which is run by Janna, who's a lovely woman it was one of my goals when I moved here. It's like, I'm going to get to know the lady who runs the store. I had a real dream for everyone to know me by name, which she does now. And so, yes, we have our one store that has all the sort of, like a little local, we call it a convenience store, I guess, at home. And then we have the cafe, which apparently has been in Hurlan for many, many years. And last year it was sold to a new couple who are running it now. They are actually both musicians in the NRK orchestra. Very interesting people. And they have great events that go on there. We have excellent concerts. We have a monthly pub quiz. So it's really, as far as services, I mean, it's the cafe and it's the store. And we actually had some friends visiting recently, and they said, it's so great because we don't have to call our friends and say, hey, where do you want to go for a beer on Friday night? Nobody calls anybody. You just know that everyone's going to be at the pub on Friday night or the cafe. So you roll on down and there everyone is. And sometimes my husband and I go down, and before you know it, there's 10 or 15 or 20 of us sitting around the table having a beer. So it's just the sort of the community hub. And that's also the same with the store. You just go in there to buy some milk, and an hour later you're hanging out and chatting with someone you've run into. So
the place where everyone knows your name.
Exactly.
What you've described sounds absolutely lovely, but is this a commuter town? Is it empty on a Wednesday lunchtime? Everyone's working in Oslo, and then they come back and it springs to life on the weekend?
Yes, it is a bit of a commuter. I mean, my husband, for example, he does work in Oslo, so he takes the train back and forth. And there are quite a number of people who do that. Not necessarily in Oslo, but they might go to Moss or to Ås or Ski or one of the kind of neighboring towns. So generally speaking, people are busy during the day. And so that for me is a bit weird because I work from home. And when I lived in Toronto, a lot of my friends were people who worked in sort of creative industries or, places you wouldn't necessarily have a 9-to-5 job. So I was very used to meeting friends, for like coffee on a Wednesday morning or something. And here that's been something I've had to get used to because the days can be a bit long and lonely. We have a dog now who I talk to, so that's good. But that, the days are, it is quiet in Hurlan during the day. And then certainly in the evenings and the weekends, it does spring to life, as you say.
Okay. We've touched on this already a little bit, but can you talk about the differences in lifestyle, having lived in the capital and now living in a small town? What are the major differences day to day?
I guess the major difference, well, first of all, just in our living space. I mean, we have a house that has space. So that was really different than living in a small apartment in Oslo. And I can go out into the garden. I can spend hours in our gardening, which is something I never have done before. I just sort of started to like it living here. So that's in our immediate sort of surroundings. But generally, the biggest difference is I could literally go a few days here without seeing another human being other than my husband, unless I make an effort, because we actually live on the hill that is just up from sort of the center of Hurlan. So it can be, in a way, very nice because it's extremely quiet, and there's a side of me that likes that. I'm very happy to just be in my house and do my thing and be a little bit of a weird hermit up on the hill. And on the other hand, it can be strange. There's some days where I think, oh my gosh, I actually have to get in my car or walk into town and go and see somebody, because this is now getting kind of weird when I'm only seeing my husband. So that was the biggest change from living in Oslo, because of course there you walk out your door and you're surrounded by people. So that has a good and not so good side to it. And then the other thing, I'd say the biggest difference has been just meeting people that we knew, people in Oslo who were friends of my husband. And so in a way, when we moved out of Oslo to the small town, he and I sort of had to start again. We were both sort of on the same page of not knowing anybody. And we were both the newcomers as opposed to it just being me. And so we needed to make the effort to meet people. And again, with this being a somewhat atypical Norwegian town, I mean, I hate the kind of stereotype that Norwegians are a bit, cold and unfriendly, but, let's be honest, it can be tricky. I think the Hurlan folks are pretty unusual in that way. The minute we moved here, we were being invited to things and told to come on down to quiz night and this and that. So that was a big difference too. People just reaching out to make friends with you, which, the apartment we lived in Oslo, I don't think I ever even met our neighbors. I maybe waved to them a couple times and they probably thought that was weird. But it's just, we've actually made friends, who would have thought?
You've cracked it. You found the answer.
Yeah, I know. Well, no, I stumble around and I think I embarrass myself on a very regular basis. And my husband has this terrible habit of never giving me any information about cultural norms or cues, because he's always just feels like I need to be myself. And he's lived out of Norway a lot, in the UK and various places. So he is very Norwegian in some ways and also isn't at all. And he doesn't necessarily ascribe to the sort of Norwegian cultural rules, if you will.
Sure.
But he knows what they are. He just maybe thinks it's funny to not let me know what they are. So I feel like I'm always making some kind of mistake, or sometimes months later, I'll think like, ooh, that was probably totally inappropriate. But luckily the people here seem very forgiving. And as a good Canadian, I'm constantly, saying I'm sorry and apologizing. So I don't know. I'm sure they just think I'm totally weird, but that's okay.
You mentioned your husband has lived in the UK, and this isn't your first expat experience either. You also spent a fair number of years in France. So I'm wondering now, how does your experience of living here in Norway compare with your husband's experience of living in the UK and of your experience of living in France?
He, interestingly, when we met and decided that we were going to try to make this long distance thing work, he was very keen to actually move to Canada. And I was the one who was quite keen to move to Norway. We also found the process of sort of immigration process in Norway seemed a lot more straightforward at the time. I'm not sure in hindsight that was true, but he's very much someone who, he would be happy to move around. He likes to have new experiences and be in new places, much like I do. So, as far as my France experience, That was so different for a number of reasons. First of all, I had been to France many times. It was a country that my mom loved. And as kids, we had spent some time there. I also spoke the language because being a good Canadian, I speak French and English. So that made it way easier, of course, to move there already knowing the language. Although my French friends used to make fun of me because I guess my French that I spoke was very sort of textbook. I learned French from a teacher who came from Paris, who was like, I don't know, very proper, Mademoiselle Couturier. And she, it wasn't the kind of French that people really speak day to day.
It never is when you learn a language.
It never
like
is,
that,
exactly.
Is
so they said that I was speaking French number 1. I had to learn French number 2. So, but again, once you know the language, it's not so hard to sort of transition into that. So yeah, I knew the language, I knew the country. I moved to a little town that I didn't know. Again, a very little town. But I was working for a Canadian company. I was guiding biking tours all over France and in Morocco. And then ended up actually getting a job working in their office as their European trip manager. So I was working with people from all over the world, working with Canadians. I didn't ever really see it as a long-term plan. I was there. I saw it as a sort of a stepping stone of, deciding what my next plan was in life, really. And when I moved back to Canada after that, I never intended to leave Canada again because I wasn't born in Canada. I moved there as a kid. I was born in South Africa. And there was always this part of me that felt like I hadn't chosen Canada. Even though I loved it, I had this sort of thing, this restlessness, like I have to be the one to choose where I'm going to live. And after spending several years in France, which I liked very much, it certainly wasn't home. And so when I moved back to Canada, I remember saying to my family and friends, oh yeah, now I feel this is home. I'm ready now to stay here. And I really got into it. I mean, I started my career in TV writing. I was doing stand-up comedy. I was really loving it and hitting my stride. And then I met this Norwegian and then everything changed again.
I think there's a common perception around the world that Norway and Canada are very similar countries. Having lived in both, do you think that's fair?
I think it's very fair. I think in some ways it's really similar. And I think sometimes in a way that makes it hard for me because I almost have an expectation that it is more similar than it is because it is so similar in many ways. And yet it's also so different, especially just the people. And like I was saying earlier, some of the cultural sort of norms, that in that way, it's very different. So sometimes, this whole sort of expat or immigrant experience is such a roller coaster. I'm sure you've been through that. And so many of your guests have, or people you've met, where there's good days and bad. It doesn't sort of start off and then it's this great sort of trajectory upward where you just become happier and happier and more at home. It really goes up and down. And there are days for me, which it's just hard being here. I miss home. I feel a bit, like, what the hell am I doing? Sometimes I think, how did I move here at this stage of my life? And I have become like a housewife. I mean, it has its very strange moments. And though in those moments, I know that other people, like I have American friends who say, well, at least in Norway, we don't have to deal with Donald Trump, or we've got health care, and there's things like that where I feel like, well, we've got that in Canada. We have great social programs. We have health care. We have, good maternity leave. We have beautiful nature. So sometimes on the bad days, I struggle. I think, what am I doing here? Because Canada is a great place to live. There's no question. And then on the good days, I appreciate that Norway has all of what Canada has.
There's a lot you like about Canada, a lot you like about Norway, a lot you like about France. One of the blog posts on your Norway Times blog that caught my eye a few years ago now was you talking about, when does Norway become home? Now we're in 2019, a few years after you wrote that post. Does Norway feel home to you? And if so, when did that happen?
You know, it's so strange. I feel like, yeah, it can almost make me feel a bit choked up because I feel like Norway is home now. And yet that's almost hard to say because I do miss my family and friends so much. And I do just miss Canada as my sort of homeland. As I said, even though I wasn't born there, I was raised there, and those are my people. So it almost feels like some strange betrayal to my family and friends and to Canada to say, oh, this is home. But it is home, and it's certainly becoming it much. You know, I'm closer to it being home than I ever have been before. And it's really has to do for me with community and with friends and with learning the language. I mean, my Norwegian is coming along. I'm not fluent yet. But it's pretty decent, and that's helped a lot. But the biggest thing is just feeling like I actually am making some friends in town. You know, I was chatting with a friend yesterday in town. When I say town, I do mean Hurlan, by the way. I should say the village. But, you know, she was at home. She was having home office day and said, oh, why don't you come down and have a coffee? So I said, oh, sure. So, you know, I just headed over to her place and sat and had a coffee for an hour or so, and you know, where the neighbors like to borrow a cup of sugar. I mean, literally, that sounds like a cliche, but honestly, we borrow sugar. So those kinds of things, to me, that's what makes it feel like home. You start to really, you know, I when I'm on my way, you know, out in the car, everyone I pass on the street, almost, I usually know who they are and wave or maybe stop and have a chat. So that we've been living in this house for 3 years, and those things have really developed a lot, I'd say, just in the last year. So that has been a huge help in really just feeling like this place is home.
You mentioned learning the language, and also that you used to work back in Canada in TV writing. So curious to know, are you watching much Norwegian TV? And if so, what do you think of it?
I'm actually a big fan of Norwegian TV. When my Norwegian wasn't good, I mean, it was really tricky, but I really sort of persevered with it because everyone kept saying, if you watch Norwegian TV shows, you know, put the text on so you can read it, and it really helps your Norwegian. And as my language skills got better and I started doing more of that, really got into some great shows. I love that there's sort of crime drama type stuff, of which there is many. That's a hugely popular genre here.
Sure.
And then once I started, I think with my blog, and I was getting more interested in sort of comedy, seeing what comedy was like in Norway, because of course comedy is one of those tricky things when you're writing it, that it's or watching it, it can be really difficult in a different culture or language of sort of what's considered funny. But I really like a lot of the Norwegian comedy. I think that it's got a very similar sensibility to Canadian or British humor. It's got a little bit of a subtlety and a kind of dry wit that I really like. And so like that Sida om Sida show on NRK, I think is absolutely hilarious. So yeah, I really like that actually. And I really appreciate the humor here. I think especially, I mean, on the TV and also just in the friends that I've met, I find it's really compatible with the sort of Canadian sense of humor that I'm used to.
Netflix in particular are starting to make quite a bit of Norwegian language content. There's a few shows that have been announced that are in development, and that of course will bring Norwegian TV to a much wider audience. Are there any shows that you think that you've seen over the last few years that could be more accessible to a wider audience, whether they were remade, translated, or simply put out there in Norwegian with subtitles?
I mean, there's that really interesting show that NRK that they've been doing now, where the Norwegian, that name has just gone out of my head for a second. I'll think of it, but they've done the Norwegian version in Norwegian, and then they shot the entire thing also in English. Do you know the one that?
It was one of the Viking shows.
Oh, Norseman.
Norseman, yeah. Yes, that's it.
Just went in my head. I mean, that's not exactly what you're asking, but that is I thought was a really interesting and unique thing. I never seen anything quite like that, where they literally did. I mean, they filmed everything in 2 languages. So there's 2 completely different language versions, and I've watched episodes in both languages, and it's interesting because the dialogue is the same, but it's very different being in English or being in Norwegian. Yeah. But anyway, apparently that show has been done really well in both languages. I think that a lot of people outside of Scandinavia this has been going on for a while now, but I think there's a real fascination with Scandinavia. And there was that show, The Bridge, which was Bruen, which was actually a Swedish-Danish co-production that did really well as an English version, or English subtitles, I guess it had. Mm-hmm. And of course, Skam, which was the big Norwegian NRK show about the teenagers, they actually made a whole American version of that, completely remade. So it's already sort of happening. And I can't think of a specific show, but I think that that's going to be happening more and more. And that's something that I would love to do, to create some kind of a show where it's a mixture of English and Norwegian and could sort of appeal to both cultures, both languages.
You're making me think of two shows in particular. One is, of course, Lillehammer, which
right,
or Lillehammer, I should say, from a few years ago. And the other one, I don't know if you've watched, is Welcome to Sweden.
Yes.
And both of those have this kind of English Norwegian or English Swedish thing going on. So I don't know if that's a trend, but those are two really interesting shows that kind of follow that model.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Lillehammer did so well. I mean, first of all, of course, it was a great cast. I mean, it was the first really of its kind, as far as I know, that really sort of used the two languages and really introduced people to Norway. The thing with both of those shows that you mentioned, because I've also seen them made in Sweden, is they all are also very much more sort of an American sensibility in a way. Not a bad thing, not to offend any Americans listening. But like I said, I think there is a slightly different sensibility with Canadian humor. And so somebody asked me about that, would I be interested in doing something that, sounds like what I'm doing, really want to do is something like Made in Sweden. And in a way, sure, it's a similar idea, but that was a very sort of slick US production. And I think it would be fun to do something that shows a little more of the quirkiness of life in Norway and a little bit more life in Norway. Now I'm stealing the name of your show. Yeah, I just think there's a different sort of subtle way to do it. I mean, my friends in Hurlan, we always joke that it's like if you made a show about living in Hurlan, it would be like Twin Peaks meets Lillehammer meets. So I like that kind of stuff. That's a bit more weird and quirky and has a real honesty about the truth of living here as an expat. It's not always easy, but sometimes it's great fun. It's all the ups and downs. And the feedback I've had from my blog over the years is that people appreciate that and relate to that. I've written articles that are really actually kind of depressing, to be honest, where I've been in a place where it's just been really hard. And sometimes those are the ones that get the most sort of feedback, or I get the most messages from readers because they say like, oh my gosh, yeah, I can really relate to that. So I think that'd be interesting to have a show that anyway, don't steal my ideas. Don't make my show.
On the topic of your blog once more, one of my other favorite posts from a few years back is how to do summer the Norwegian way. What do you mean by doing summer the Norwegian way?
Oh, right. Remember that was the first summer I think we were living in our new house. We'd moved in, I believe it was the 1st of June.
Right.
And I had never experienced a full summer in Norway because I'd moved in the fall. We lived those 6 months or so in Oslo through the winter, and then moved here in the spring, early summer. And I remember one day, it was a nice day outside, and I was inside doing something. And my husband came inside and almost like irritated with me and said, what are you doing? I said, well, I don't know. Like, I don't know what I was doing, probably wiping the counter or something inane. And he said, well, you gotta get outside. And I said, why? What's happening? What's going on? He's like, well, it's summer. Like, first of all, it was like 10 degrees, Well, okay, it's summer, sure. So it was like, oh, okay. And I realized there was like this urgency and this insistence of, I don't care what's going on. If it's summer and the sun's shining, you got to be outside. And it was really funny for me to realize that it was fairly intense. And so I sort of asked my husband about it later. And he said, yeah, I think it's one of those things that it's just so, deep in your Norwegian soul that you have to be out when the weather is nice and the sun is shining. Sort of the same thing with Norwegians, the whole Sunday thing. Like you're supposed to get up and go for a walk or a hike or something on Sunday before you come back and, watch skiing on TV or do whatever else you do. It's like this, you have to earn your relaxation. And I mean, we don't always do that, to be honest. We're not typical in that way. We feel fairly comfortable lazing around a bit more. But I still see it in my husband sometimes. It's like a twitch, this restlessness of like, and he'll say like, oh, I should really do this or I should do that. And it's like, yeah, we don't have to do anything. But yeah, it's an intense thing. It's no joke. Like get outside or be banned from this land or something like that.
Jill, we could sit here and chat all day, I am sure of that, but we are out of time. So I am just going to ask you the 3 questions that I ask every guest. What's the best thing about living in Norway?
The best thing about living in Norway for me now is this little town that we live in and the people who live in it.
And it's not like Twin Peaks at all?
No, a little bit, in a good way.
What do you find most challenging about living in Norway?
So many expats would say this. It's a bit cliche, but honestly, it's just missing my friends and family. It's missing those people who've known you for your whole life, or almost your whole life, and dropping in and not having to be polite. You just walk in their front door and lie on their couch and drink tea, and those kinds of friends or family. My nieces, not seeing them grow up on a weekly basis. So that's the hardest, yeah. And constantly embarrassing myself with social faux pas and mispronunciation of the language. But,
do you know what you said, first of all, I think is absolutely spot on. And it has to be, I think the worst thing about the expat experience, and it's something that not many of us really talk about that much, is, your best friends from before you moved to Norway are probably not your best friends anymore. There's this gradual loosening of the friendships over time, and that can really feel devastating in the long term. You return home after 10 years or something and you realize everyone's different, they've moved on with their lives and you don't know them anymore. It really is quite a challenge. So
now you're making me panic. Is that what's going to happen? Now I feel like crying. That's horrible.
Maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you do lose touch with people, I think, and you when you live in a foreign country like we do, you have to be very proactive about maintaining those relationships, or they will naturally fade away.
No, it's true. I mean, look, I have a few very close girlfriends in Canada who are my friends from way, way back in the day. Like 30 years, and one of them's already been here to visit, and 3 of them are coming, or 4 of them are coming next year for a ski trip. So I am making every effort possible to stay in touch with them. And thank goodness for things like, Facebook and Skype and FaceTime and whatever, that we do have those connections. But yeah, now I'm terrified. Now you've made me terrified that I'm going to lose all my friends. So
it sounds to me like you're going to be just fine.
Great. Thank you.
Last question, Jill. What's your favorite place in Norway, whether it's a whole town, I think I know where you might say, or a small special spot somewhere hidden away?
Yes, it's become obvious. My favorite place is, my favorite absolute place is my house. I love being in my house, and I love our little town of Hølen. And if I had to be very specific, there's a place right on the fjord where we go swimming in the summer, and it's also a great place to go for a hike with the dog. And whether it's midwinter or midsummer, you hike up to this point where you get a view out over the fjord, and it is so beautiful. And no matter how I'm feeling, I can be having one of those bad days where I just want to, run back to Canada. But that place always makes me happy. I look at the view and think, oh my gosh, yeah, it doesn't get much better than this.
Wonderful. Yeah. And what a perfect moment to stop the show. Jill, thank you so much. Where can people find out more about your blog?
Yeah, thank you. They can look on Facebook, and it's on it's Norway Times, right on Facebook. Or if they want to find my blog, the blog address is www.norwaytimes.live. And I'll be honest, I have been terrible about writing lately just because I'm working on these new creative projects. But from time to time, I surprise everyone with a new article.
Excellent. Well, there's some good material there from many years ago as well. So
Thank you.
I highly recommend anyone interested in finding out a little bit more about what it's like to live in small town Norway. Head on over to norwaytimes.live. Well, you can find out more information on today's show, including links to everything we've discussed at lifeinnorway.net/podcast. Jill, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you, David.